engineering design, analysis and testing services, data management services, right? So if you think about the industry as a whole, there's many I haven't mentioned there. Yeah? There's all the environmental services. Yeah? If you're concerned about that kind of industry, you're going to be wanting to look in the schedule at whether there are any entries in market access or any failures to protect regulation and national treatments that are going to mean that you can't keep what you've got in regulating that sector, or you can't introduce new regulations in the future. Now, to give my very favourite example, Venezuela, under the pre-Chavez period, had a very neoliberal government. It has an oil and gas company, state-owned, called PDVSA. PDVSA was run by a bunch of very neoliberal management team, and part of what they did was they outsourced the operation of the computer services that ran the entire operation of PDVSA, because it's all computerized these days. Every single, the checking that it's not going to blow a gasket, to what the inventory is, to how far down you have to drill, to sending the stuff off to market, everything is computerized. And they outsourced the whole of that computer system to a company in the US, on which the board of directors included a number of former CIA operatives. And when Chavez came in, the senior managers basically went on strike. And to complement that, the computer systems were shut down from the US. Now, the previous neoliberal government had not made commitments on services related to energy, or the really obvious energy stuff. But they've made commitments on computer services in Mode 1, which meant that when the Chavez government decided that they were going to take these services back in-house, they were shutting off the outsiders from being able to provide the computer services. And arguably, they were also imposing a monopoly as well. And so they were quite surprised, because they hadn't the slightest idea that they were going to be caught in this way. They ended up not being sued by the US under the GATS. There was a question of whether they might be able to use the national security exception. But the problem with that is that the national security exception is quite limited in what it covers. And it has to, and we'll cover this on Friday briefly. But you can only take action that breaches your obligations during, amongst other things, an emergency in international relations. Now, question. One, would the US actually want to have to argue about that in a panel? And two, what would a trade panel actually decide? And a trade panel would end up deciding what effectively was the national security interests and the right to action of Venezuela to take when it considered it was under threat. Yeah. So that's my very favourite example of how this can have really unintended consequence in the natural resource sector. Yeah. You with me? I've given a mining example that's kind of similar to that. Forestry. There's a lot of R&D work in forestry these days. There's a lot of development of cloned plants and the very careful monopoly marketing of those. Obviously, there's issues of land acquisition and land clearance. There's issues around plantation forestry that include, and we have this in New Zealand at present, lots of health and safety issues because we've been having deaths in the forestry from lack of effective regulation. There's pulp and paper mills, which have all sorts of nasty toxic issues, including impacts on Indigenous peoples in a lot of the areas where they're operating. Water supply and waste disposal, road and sea transport financing, especially because these tend to be longer term. You know, you're growing trees, it takes a while for the trees to actually get to maturation and you get your money back. Newspaper printing and production, the downstream part of the pulp and paper. Advertising, wholesale, retail distribution of the end products and so on. Yeah? And so those who are working in environmental areas dealing with forestry issues, these are important questions, not just the non-discrimination questions and the questions of are you imposing numerical restrictions or economic needs tests or particular legal forms or capping the total foreign ownership of the sector, but also when we come to domestic regulation, licensing, rules and procedures, the technical standards, the administration of those procedures, and administration of general environmental regulations and so on. Right? So I wanted to give those examples. I hope it's helped those who were struggling a bit with the commodity versus the services thing. I haven't used the food example, but because it was one of a few things I had to do overnight, right? Okay, how do we find out then when we have this list of subsectors that our governments have committed, what it is that they have committed? If you look in the W120 list, you will see the name of the subsector and a number in the column next to it, yeah? Yeah? And, oh, you might like me to bring that up, might you? W120?